This is a video essay responding to a video essay about video essays. So this is pretty much video essay-ception. The video essay in question is How Video Essays Are Deceiving You by Blueshades. Let me start by saying that Blueshades' video didn't make me angry, mad, or upset. For the most part, his take is reasonable and well articulated. His main point is that the majority of video essays rely too much on objective technique or how filmmakers use technique to affect the viewer, without enough reference to the subjective qualities of the film or how it makes them feel. I find this misses the point of essays in general, which is to prove a unique thesis using the text and related theory. In order to justify my outrage at his embrace of the subjective and disregard of the objective, I will explicate his errors on a point-by-point basis. To do this, I will compare and contrast the film techniques of David Fincher, explained in a particular Nerdwriter video how David Fincher hijacks your eyes, featured in Blueshades' video, to those of Agnes Varde's 1985 film Vagabond. In particular, I will explain how Vardes and Fincher differ in their use of camera movement in relation to the movement of their actors, and how that difference conveys completely different meanings and subjective viewer experiences. I hope that this contrast will illuminate the importance of technique and objective analysis in backing up or proving a thesis. As a quick aside, I find it ironic that Blueshades' video attempts to prove with textual analysis the thesis that proving a thesis using textual analysis is corrosive to discourse.
On YouTube, academic sources and educated opinions are a gray area when it comes to video essays. What might just be conjecture in an opinion piece may be relayed to others as fact through its very deliberate and well put together presentation. However, this genre has been plagued by idiosyncrasies, and many are starting to notice and criticize the video essay format. While many video essayists may not intend for this to happen, they might be manufacturing how we view media critically, and I think it's for the worst. What I specifically mean by this is that video essayists are trying to make their opinion pieces seem more like the end-all be-all objective truth on the matter, intentionally or not.
He begins by saying that YouTube video essayists attempt to convey their own interpretations as facts. This implies that some amount of deception is going on in the bulk of video essays. This misses the point of an essay, which is to convince a reader or viewer of your thesis. In order to convince somebody of your point of view, you must convey confidence in your words. He goes on to say that 3 elements of presentation go into conveying their intellectual or academic prowess: editing, writing, and vocal delivery.
One of the most entrancing things about video essays is their presentation. Whether it be their editing, writing, or vocal delivery, it can elicit a feeling of academic or intellectual prowess. While it may feel that way, you have to realize that some video essayists purposely do this. They keep the style of aesthetically pleasing lo-fi hip-hop beats or jazz while delivering lines in a very oratorical style. I feel that this often gives a vibe of superficial grandeur. I understand that it is very appealing, and it does work. The deliberate editing of these videos contribute to this ruse.
He says that some video essayists purposefully speak in an oratorical style which gives their thesis a, quote, vibe of superficial grandeur, unquote, and that the deliberate editing contributes to this quote-unquote ruse. Well, this is not a ruse. This is how academic works are supposed to be done. Deliberate editing is a necessary component of any video which wants to be taken seriously, and the authoritative oratorical style is necessary for your points to be taken seriously as well. Remember that all essays attempt to prove some thesis, and this can only be done by speaking in the declarative. It is also important to note that multiple interpretations are not mutually exclusive. The simple fact of proving one interpretation of a film does not exclude all other interpretations. But for any interpretation to be taken seriously, it must be well thought out and proven with textual evidence. Anybody with a degree in liberal arts will agree that the only good essays are those which have a clearly defined thesis which is proven with evidence. Anything which is tentative or left up to interpretation will necessarily be unconvincing. Here Blueshades really pulls the wool back and explains his thesis outright.
What I really wanted to expand upon with that statement is how video essayists are framing themselves as objective as possible, rather than trying to reconcile with the subjective aspects of it. A lot of video essayists attempt to bring mechanics and technique of whatever medium they are talking about to logically frame their editorials and pieces. You're probably saying to yourself, well, what's wrong with that? Providing rational evidence to support your claim is just how these people prove their point. While you are correct, it is the amount of emphasis we give to the evidence of something rather than the opinion. We attempt to gauge the value of subjective elements of whatever media we're writing about by trying to equate objective evidence. Personally, I find it more meaningful to talk about the subjective elements of a piece because it allows more speculation and doesn't rob any artistic intent away from the creators. The fun and intrigue of making videos like this is to share your outlook on a piece of art or media, but we really don't need to always use strict analytical structures.
I strongly disagree with this. Subjective analysis is great and all, but it is inherently limited in terms of academic discourse, since it can only ever relate one's own feelings about a work, whereas objective analysis can explicate a concrete thesis through the lens of film theory, or technique which has been built up for generations. There is immense value in the techniques employed by filmmakers in all facets, objective and subjective, of a film. And make no mistake, filmmakers use specific techniques deliberately to flesh out characters and setting, convey feelings to the viewer, and even make statements about the purpose and reach of film as an art form. I take particular umbrage to his statement that technical and objective film analysis robs artistic intent from the creator, because this disregards the entire field of film theory, which is based on technique and meant to be as objective as possible. This is why it's taken seriously. Some filmmakers, such as Darren, Pasolini, Tarkovsky, and Brakhage, among others, even write about their own films, explaining why they used specific techniques and what those techniques do and are meant to convey. A video simply about how a film makes you feel isn't inherently meaningless. I'm sure it can bring great value to a viewer and be a good outlet for the creator, but I don't think it would qualify as an essay. Without a framework of film theory and reference to specific techniques, focusing on the subjective can amount to little more than a video diary. Next, he features Nerdwriter's video, How David Fincher Hijacks Your Eyes, ironically referencing Nerdwriter's technique to prove his thesis that referencing technique misses the point.
I find it annoying that there is so much reliance on trying to equate technique in relation to a shot's core meaning or a director's intent. These are just my nitpicks as a filmmaker. When we attempt to view a shot's meaning only through the production techniques used, we are robbing ourselves of exploring the nuance of a shot. Video essayists apply perceptible information to something rather than attempting to make it transformative for the viewer. Sure, you might learn how the composition of a certain shot may contribute to motifs and themes of a movie, but there isn't much going further. It feels more like an attempt to secure a monolithic smoking gun interpretation.
This is what essays are supposed to do. An essay should prove a thesis, but not to the exclusion of any other thesis. This is the point he seems to be missing. An essayist isn't required to explain all other possible interpretations, or even leave room for any other interpretations in their essay. If someone has an alternative interpretation, they are free to essay about their interpretation, and multiple, even contradictory interpretations can coexist. This is not a problem. He goes on to play a clip from Malmrose's podcast.
The funny thing about this is that the counterpoint to that would be, what does an objective video essay look like? And when I think of that, what springs to mind is stuff like Every Frame of Painting and Nerdwriter. People who have this sort of authoritative pseudo-academic tone, and they talk technicals. They talk about the way that David Fincher frames a shot and stuff like that. They talk about it in terms of how things are and not what they mean or why it matters. And sometimes they do talk about why it matters, but they talk about it in terms of like how it might hypothetically affect an audience, how it might hypothetically affect the viewer, the abstract notion of the viewer. I don't care for that style. A lot of people do care for it, a lot of people like it, and that's fine, you're allowed to like that. But the problem is we've devalued the subjective perspective on art and on film.
You may disagree with me on this, but I want to see more video essays that talk about the subjective interpretations that provoke something emotional or intellectual to its viewers. Talking technical about certain films can certainly get the mind wandering with what you can do with certain things, but I feel way more inspired when a creator talks about the subtextual elements behind something and emphasizes that. We can all relay our knowledge from film school or game design class, but it really doesn't do much for engaging in meaningful discourse about art.
This is where I think Blueshades completely misses the mark. You see, the techniques employed by a filmmaker are deliberately used for characterization, fleshing out the setting, or to give the viewer a specific, subjective experience. Look at Nerdwriter's video, an example Blueshades posits as not examining the subjective elements of film. It explains what the techniques mean and why they matter, and how they affect the viewer's subjective experience. He specifically says that the painstaking lockstep of camera and actor movement creates a unique feeling of closeness between the viewer and the actor. You see, technique and film theory go hand in hand with the subjective elements of film, especially film as art. And to demonstrate this, I will contrast how Fincher uses camera movement with that of Vagabond by Agnes Varde.
Essentially, what he tries to do is have the camera exactly match the velocity and direction of the moving character in the frame. When the character stops, the camera stops too, and starts again when the person starts to move again. The matching movement here isn't just close. It's perfect. So perfect, in fact, that it must involve some kind of timed rehearsal with the actors, which I learned when I tried to do it myself earlier.
Again.
This is no doubt a part of the reason why Fincher is known for doing so many takes. It takes patience and a good camera operator to get these moves exactly right, and they're happening all the time, everywhere, in little shots, in between shots, shots you notice and shots you don't. And whether they register or not, the effect starts to accumulate in your mind. All of a sudden, Fincher's reality is your reality. Now, I think there's a very good reason why this happens, and it's a bit counterintuitive when you consider that Fincher's camera work is often regarded as impersonal or coldly omniscient, even by Fincher himself. I think that's somewhat disingenuous, because what these shots do is effectively lock you into the behavior of the characters. You really feel it when someone moves around the space that they're in. Even small gestures like a shrug or deflated shoulders, even the slightest change in posture is registered by this camera. In this way, I think Fincher's cinematography is a lot more personal than even he makes out. It might happen just below the level of consciousness, but I'm much more in sync with this character than I am with, for example, this character. It's funny, Fincher's actors have to move in these very deliberate lines at steady speeds, probably ironed out by rehearsal. But the result, at least for me, is a greater connection to the character than something that is more free form, less exact.
Here, Nerdwriter explains how Fincher uses tracking shots in direct tandem with his actors' movements. He explains that this technique locks the viewer into the behavior and therefore emotions of the characters. He says that this technique creates a personal relationship between the viewer and the actor, and I agree with him. With camera movements, let's take a tracking shot for example, which perfectly follow his actors. He creates a closeness between the actors and the viewers, causing the viewers to feel connected to the actors. Notice how the technique and the viewer's subjectivity are intimately related, not mutually exclusive. The technique informs the viewer's experience. Vagabond takes the opposite approach, but doesn't yield the opposite result. In Vagabond, Varde uses smooth tracking shots to frame Mona, the main character, just like Fincher would, but the difference is she doesn't follow her movements perfectly with the camera. Rather, the camera follows a steady path and she moves freely within the frame, entering the frame and leaving it as she chooses. This technique indicates to the viewer, subconsciously or otherwise, that Mona is not confined by her environment, rather that she is her own boss, so to speak. She doesn't follow society's guidelines because she doesn't even follow the camera's guidelines. Given the context of the film, which follows her from place to place as she journeys with not much more than the clothes on her back, this simple technique is immensely useful in conveying to the viewer her free spirit and attitude towards life, specifically that she does not feel bound by societal norms. So you may be thinking, great, you demonstrated how Varde uses film technique to characterize Mona, but you haven't addressed Blueshades' point about the neglect of the viewer's subjective experience in these essays. Ye've little faith. You see, every film technique employed by a competent director is used to manipulate the viewer into feeling something. So it's trivially easy to demonstrate the interface of technique with the subjective experience. Mona's proclivity to move in and out of the frame creates a similar dissonance in the viewer caused by Varde's rejection of classical techniques in favor of more progressive ones and creative use of classical techniques. Once Mona has left the frame, the camera continues moving, and the viewer is left without her, the emotional center of the film, only to be disoriented further by abruptly being transported to a new mysterious location. The contrast in how Varde in Vagabond and Fincher track characters with camera movements, as well as the contrast in how this affects both the film thematically and the viewer's subjectivity, demonstrates how technique is not only vital to film theory, and by extension film essays and video essays, but also how the viewer's subjectivity is inexorably tied to the technique. Indeed, all competent filmmakers use techniques to emotionally manipulate the audience into feeling a certain way. Therefore, I do not see film technique as antithetical to viewer subjectivity. Directors deliberately use specific techniques to elicit specific emotional responses from the viewer. Technique and subjectivity are intertwined, not mutually exclusive. And I believe that any attempt at film analysis must take both sides of the coin into account, lest they miss the point entirely.